Thank you to everyone who's joined us tonight. It's an absolute pleasure. It's our last event or virtual event of 2020, and we're delighted that all our virtual audience have joined us for almost 9 months now. We do appreciate your interactions and support, and we hope that we provided some sustenance and sense of community over the lockdown period. And thank you also to our speakers who have also contributed to the programme and our speakers tonight. So tonight we have 3 speakers. The first part of the talk is going to be given by Lynda Albertson, who I'll introduce, and then we will hand over to Roberta Mazza and Marcel Marée, who will discuss some of the topics that Lynda brings up. And then you will be very welcome to join the discussion using the Q&A function. So I'll start with our main speaker, who is Lynda Albertson, as I said, and she is the CEO, waving, is the CEO of the Association for Research into Crimes Against Art, which is also known as ARCA, and you can look up their website. It's a CSO that focuses on research and capacity building in the understanding and prevention of art-related crimes to better preserve the world's collective cultural heritage. In this role, Albertson spearheads ARCA's transnational crime mapping project. She also co-facilitates ARCA's training programs for cultural heritage professionals in the MENA region and Europe. And I've looked at some of those courses and they seem really wonderful. So thank you, Lynda, for doing all your work. She has brought together brilliant panelists. The first is Roberta Mazza, who is on screen but on mute. She is a papyrologist, I've been struggling with that word all day, and lecturer in Greco-Roman material culture at the University of Manchester. She's worked on late antiquity and Christianity in Egypt and has published on papyri from the John Rylands collection. Her recent research and publications focus on the ethics of public and private collecting of Egyptian manuscripts and academic involvement with the Antiquities market. And she has published a book chapter on papyrology and the Museum of the Bible in a collective volume, The Museum of the Bible, A Critical Introduction, and that was published in 2019. And she's also intervened publicly on the issues surrounding the institution in her blog, so do consult that, and the link is on our website. And Marcel, who will be joining us in a minute, but to discuss some of the issues and case studies that Lynda will mention, is curator of the Department of Egypt and Sudan in the British Museum. He's an archaeological fieldwork at various sites in Egypt and Sudan, and his principal areas of expertise are pharaonic material and provenance research. Marée, or Marcel, has initiated and leads the British Museum's circulating artefacts project, which is called CircArt, and we're looking forward to hearing more about that. It launched in 2018 to help counteract the widespread trade in antiquities from illicit in excavations. The Cultural Protection Fund, run by the British Council for the UK's Department of Culture, DCMS, supports CircArt's creation of an online platform for the reporting, documentation and study of objects circulating on the international art market. Apart from offering advice to registered users, CircArt is also providing support and skill sharing to heritage professionals. So it's really important work in countries affected by large-scale looting. The current focus rests on Egypt and Sudan, but it's hoped that project will soon expand. So thank you very much. We look forward to Marcel joining us, but I'm going to hand over now to Lynda, which is the art market's laundrymen, examining the art world's witting and unwitting partners in crime. And Lynda's going to share her screen. I'll turn into the BSR events logo, and she'll talk for about 40 minutes, and then we can, answer your questions after that. So thank you very much. Thank you to all our speakers.
Okay, give me just 1 second, guys, and I'll share my screen here.
Fantastic, brilliant. And I will mute myself and
let me get to the first slide here. Hold on. Play from the start. First, I'd like to say, thank you to Stephen Miller and Harriet O'Neill and Stephen Kay and Claire Burridge and everyone at the British School in Rome for inviting ARCA and for asking me to give a presentation on the last of their lecture series for 2020, and I thank them a bunch for keeping everyone safe, because in the age of COVID, that's also a high priority for everyone. So I started my slide with a little picture of the Colosseum, because that's about as close to it as any of us will get these days, thanks to what's been going on in the world. I'd also like to thank Marcel, Marée, and Roberta Mazza, both of whom agreed to come and speak after my presentation today to share their expertise as it relates to some of the type of casework that ARCA is going to mention during the course of this presentation today. But I'm going to try and get right to it. For those of you in the audience who don't know who ARCA is, we're a civil society organization. We work to disseminate information to stakeholders related to art crime in general and art and antiquities crime in particular as it relates to this particular group. We organize trainings, we have forums, we have work groups, and we collect and we analyze quite a lot of data, most of which was publicly available, some of it which is not, for multiple countries around the world. And we try and assist with clarifying what the situation is in any given period of time as it relates to art and antiquities crime. And with that, I'm going to, kind of go ahead and get started and talk a little bit about art and antiquities crime. Oftentimes we think of the illicit supply chain in very dramatic ways. And that a lot of that has to do with social media. It has to do with the instantaneousness of communications via journalistic outlets or, television stations, these kinds of things. But what we have to try and remember is that, there's been collecting and the buying and selling of ancient antiquities for thousands of years. We've got documented proof in China and Sumeria. Art was sold in ancient Egyptian times, in ancient Greece and in Rome. The sacking in Corinth, for example, in 146 BC was one of the first and certainly one of the greatest auction sales in history. And back then, sacking was actually celebrated versus condemned as it is today. But as we look at things today, we see that situation has changed. There are more ethical collecting practices, and people are not, going out triumphing over the conquering of another nation and then, carting off all of their beauty along with that. But sometimes when we look at what is happening with respect to looting and plunder today, we oftentimes look at it very much with a today only kind of viewpoint. And that's one of the things that ARCA tries to stress when we provide information about what we see happening in the market, is that you can't just time capsule what is happening today. You can't just think of looting and plunder as being something that only happens in war-torn countries or post-conflict countries, because that's not the case. If you look at the photo that you see on my screen at this particular moment, you see images of destruction and objects that were looted during the current Syrian crisis. But if we step back in time just a little bit farther away from the dramatic images that we see in this particular conflict, we can realize that even when there's no conflict at all, or no Daesh, no ISIS at all, that there's been looting happening in the Middle East and problems with destruction in the Middle East, quite a few years ago. This is not anything new. It's just that this is what's first and foremost in people's minds. So, I've got a newspaper screen up right now from June 16th, 1969, where it's indicated in the New York Times that different artifacts were being taken from areas under Israeli control that were being removed without the permission of the holders of the objects. So sometimes another aspect that we see often with the news broadcast of how and what is the problem as it relates to illicit trafficking is we get a lot of figures, we get a lot of numbers thrown out that are sometimes then echoed almost in continuity, in continuity through different journalistic organizations, through Twitter, through Facebook, through meetings at high levels with different countries. So one of the biggest comments that you see a lot when people start discussing, organized crime or illicit trafficking or art and illicit antiquities trafficking is that it's the third largest crime behind guns and arms. So I put a little sample here of just some of the quick Google searches you can do. If you look up just the phrase third largest crime behind, or third largest criminal sector, and you can see here that, in some cases they're saying that it's environmental crime. Some people say that it's art and antiquities crime. Some say it's human trafficking. Some say it's illegal logging. So it really is a way for journalistic organizations and individuals that want to draw attention to kind of look at the subject matter in a, kind of an impressive way to draw people's attention to it. But it's not actually something that we can quantify at that kind of a level. It's a different type of crime than other types of crime. If you look at organized crime or human trafficking as it relates to humans or weapons, you can count the number of weapons seized and come up with some numbers. You can count the number of humans who have been released from bondage. And that's not always quite so easy when it comes to art and antiquities. And to show you what I mean by that, I'm going to use an example of just a slight video that I have here of one of the largest seizures in history in Bogota, Colombia, of cocaine. Now, if we were trying to quantify this cocaine seizure, we could quantify it in several different ways. We could quantify it based on weight. We could quantify it based on value. So how much is this seizure of illicit cocaine worth? Now, before you could come up with a figure, you'd have to weigh the drug. After you weighed the drug, you'd have to decide what figure you were going to use to multiply by. What is the value on the street? What is the value as it relates to wholesale value? And then once you decide that, you have to decide which wholesale value you're referring to. The wholesale value in Bogota, the wholesale value in the United Kingdom, the wholesale value in mainland Europe, all to come up with a statistical figure as it relates to cocaine. And cocaine is an object you can seize, weigh, and come up with at least an identifiable cost, even if that cost does vary. Now let's look at art. How much would you value these individual vase shards in and of themselves, broken pieces of vase? Now, one could say they're not worth much at all because they don't give the complete object. To a museum, though, that might have the rest of the pieces of that particular object, they might be willing to pay a very large amount of money for an object like this. So it could have very little value or it could have a very high value, depending on what the image itself is on the pot shard and how it relates to other pieces that are already in a collection. How much would you estimate a Freeport seizure of this quantity of art? Would you base it on the value of when the seizure occurred? Or would you base it on the value today? How would you value a Van Gogh? When the Van Goghs were recovered in Naples, we got a lot of different prices for these pieces. The Guardian the Telegraph said that these paintings were worth $100 million. Okay. The director of the Van Gogh Museum estimated them at $4.5 million. Okay. And to the trustees of the Van Gogh Museum, they valued them as priceless. So if you were to try and quantify,
you've been placed on hold. Please wait.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
You carry on. I think it might be Marcel trying to join us via phone. So yes,
okay.
so he's listening via his phone. So you carry on and I'll mute myself
perfect.
and on the video, but thank you.
Okay. So what I'm
You've
trying
been placed on hold. Please wait.
Establish in this conversation with you guys is what the true value of a rare antiquity or an object is in the eyes of the interpreter. So obviously a newspaper such as the Telegraph in the case of the Van Gogh paintings is going to want a nice huge figure to show, wow, this is a restitution of an object that is just like phenomenal. Isn't that great? While, a museum that has hundreds of objects that are related to Van Gogh probably has a more reasonable idea of what the value of their collection is, both in terms of like insuring those pieces when they travel, but also in general terms, in terms of the history of the paintings that Van Gogh made. So it really is a variable subject. So it's not easy to, sit down and say this is a $3 billion problem or a $1 billion problem. Not to mention the fact that for the most part, criminals are not likely to open up their bank account records and tell you this is how much I made in any specific period of time. If we wanted to look at how law enforcement quantifies the value of art, just one group of people that are working on illicit trafficking, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, has estimated they have recovered $150 million worth of stolen art. But collecting those types of numbers and figures are generally not, put together in sums that can be truly interpreted. But that's oftentimes what journalistic organizations want. So I wanted to kind of bring these misnomers or sometimes exaggerations or sometimes under exaggerations, because we really don't know. It might be a huge number or it might be a smaller number than what's been batted about, to say that it's not as easy to identify how large the problem is. But what I will show you through the 4 case studies examples through this presentation today is that it is a problem. It's a real problem. It causes significant damage, and we need to work to mitigate that damage. Rather, if the theft occurs as the result of, a terrorist that then uses the money to purchase arms, or an organized criminal who uses it in the case of the Van Gogh paintings to plea bargain down his sentence over time, those are pretty big deals to me. I don't really lose much sleep over the fact that, a painting is worth X or the Euphrosyne crater was worth Y. I'm more concerned that somebody doing something illegal profited from that, either profited financially or profited in manipulating the system to where they got a lesser sentence, or in some cases are not sentenced at all. So that's something I want to underscore in this presentation. I'm going to also use here an example that is a graph that was created by Marée from the DePaul University to kind of set the stage for what we're going to talk about with these 4 case studies. So when I think of looting and plunder as it relates to illicit antiquities, sometimes you'll hear people refer to source nations or market nations. I'm going to refer to them as harvest nations, okay? Because in this case, they're being harvested from one country and then they're being consumed by another country. So I've modified Dr. Kessel's commodities pyramid slightly to kind of keep in with that keeping. So the distribution of pieces come in a lot of different shapes and forms. Artwork moves through the market through online sales sites, famous ones like eBay or Katawiki or Invaluable or Vcoin. Less famous ones, online sales sites by the dealers themselves with their own, websites and addresses. Collectors that are collector dealers that kind of sit in both camps, or licensed dealers and unlicensed dealers. They're the ones that distribute things into the market. The consumers in the market are people like museums or educational institutions that have collections, casual collectors or non-casual collectors, and tourists that come and buy things from different organizations. And then the people that harvest could be, the actual tomb raider, the looter or the thief, the middleman overseer that kind of works between as a communication layer between the middleman and getting the pieces out of the country in the way of courier. So this is just how the supply chain for illicit trafficking is kind of generalized to look at. But who are the looters? Looters come in all shapes and sizes. They can be adults, they can be children, they can be organized crime actors, they can be militia people from terrorist organizations, they can be soldiers, legitimate soldiers. So it really, you can't label them as just one type of individual. What it is that they see that there's a market. And with that market, they move merchandise back and forth. This is a picture of a site guard in the area outside of Cairo that is overseeing an area that is been looted quite extensively. And I hope Dr. Marcel will talk a little bit about that when he comes on a bit later. Sometimes looters look like this. Children are often used to loot sites, especially those that have small access spaces. And in Egypt alone, a significant number of those children have died as the result of collapses and problems with, just digging out from underneath people's houses where there's known to be archaeological material. But it's not just children, and it's not just terrorists. Sometimes it's dads. A 55-year-old father in Viterbo, which is a city just north of Rome, suffocated when a tomb he was excavating collapsed on top of him, and he was buried alive. And before the two gentlemen that were with him excavating could pull him out, he died from his injuries. So let's continue, though, to see what else happens. So we have a wide array of individuals who are looting of all different shapes and sizes. And to loot, you need certain tools. And what we find is that those tools are the same as you move from country to country. So in these 4 photos, you see what is called a Espilone, which is a tool that is sometimes used by looters to determine if there's a hard space underground, and it helps them to determine the entrances to tombs or pockets where there might be material. All 4 of these photos are from different locations, but as you can see with each of them, the objects and the tools used in the illicit trade are very similar from one country to the next, be it Cambodia, be it Italy, be it Peru, or be it Iraq, as is the case on the picture on the right. And now with the age of Facebook, you see these types of objects being mentioned even on social media. So they're learning at a much faster rate than they would have just a few years ago, simply by the fact that we publish this type of information and it's out there on the web. The fact that it is out on the web is the reason why I'm publishing the pictures now, because they can be found already. But it's generally not something you would want to teach people. Another way people learn to loot or to plunder is through the vacuum of there not being the controls, the social controls that are there. So in the case of the conflicts in Syria, we have information that shows that people that perhaps were once workmen on existing illicit archaeological excavations have then turned to practice the same trade in the vacuum of controls post the start of the conflict. So it's one of those things where people are learning the trade from people that are already involved in the illicit market, or they're learning how to excavate, sometimes even through their exposure to illicit digs and excavations and academics throughout the world. To understand where is being looted, sometimes you have to look in a variety of places. We hear a lot about post-conflict and conflict excavations and moonscapes, but what we don't realize is that those same types of moonscapes occur around the globe. Just about any place where you can find material of a sellable nature as it relates to ancient history. So I've drawn a couple of arrows here just so that you can see just a few of the moonscapes that are found around the globe as the result of people excavating and then selling illicit material. So we've got the United States, we've got Bulgaria, we've got Syria, we've got Iraq, we've got Cambodia, we've got Peru, we've got Guatemala. The list goes on and on. We've got Egypt. I left Egypt off as well. But it's just to say that it's not just a problem in one particular area, but it is a global problem, made all the much worse when there are lack of control and security in specific areas, or lack of interest altogether. Who buys ancient art that is sometimes not necessarily legitimate? sometimes it's famous people. And here's a group of several famous people who buy ancient art from dealers and add to their collections. Sometimes it's people that go to fairs, like the Tefaf fair that is held every year up in Maastricht. Sometimes it's fairs that take place in London, or fairs that take place in New York, or in auction houses and gallery showrooms. So now we're going to move a bit into the part of my presentation where I talk about specific cases. And in 2019, one of the world's largest art fairs, Tefaf, had 279 exhibiting dealers. 2020 was much smaller because we already saw some of the problems and changes that were occurring as the result of the pandemic. But at the 2019 Tefaf, 35,000 objects of art were on displays, and dealers were closing six-figure sales at quite a leisurely pace. During that sale, I happened to come across this particular idol, Nalanda Buddha, and began talking with a colleague of mine who is works on identifying art that has been stolen from India and the areas around Nepal. So I spoke with Vijay Kumar, sent him some pictures of some objects that to me were possibly questionable. And we began speaking about, was there a match or not? Now, bear in mind that when you're at a trade show, the idea of finding art that has been looted is oftentimes more readily found, because those objects do not necessarily have a history. From the time they're excavated into the ground to they appear in the market with falsified provenance, there's no proof that the paper trail that's created is necessarily incorrect, unless there's something that tells you that the paperwork is bad. But in the case of a stolen object, which in this particular idol's case, it is a stolen object, it was stolen from a museum in the 1960s. So it was documented. And through speaking with Vijay and sharing information back and forth with him, he was able to quickly provide us with archival records that showed when this object was stolen, as well as, thankfully, a photo, one of 9 photos of the 14 objects that were stolen on 2 different dates in the early 1960s in Bihar, India. So as you see in the top upper right-hand corner is the little bronze that we identified at Tefaf. Now, what happens when you find an object like this? It's not just, hooray, yes, we've identified it, it automatically comes home. I wish that were the case. It's more often than not that it's not that case. When an object is identified in the market, a lot of hands have to be involved before an artwork can be restituted to a country of origin. First, you need to know what the laws are in the country where that object presently is and what their rules are as they relate to good faith purchases or bad faith purchases. In the case of, like, if you knew that the dealer that was selling the object was acting in bad faith, there's actually in some countries statutes of limitations on holding bad faith artwork. So it just depends on what the particular country is. So in this case, with this particular Buddha, we were looking at a sale that was, or a fair that was taking place in Maastricht, with an object that was with a dealer that had a location in the United Kingdom and in the Far East. And by the time we got all of these little pieces of paperwork together to determine, yes, we had a match in this particular case, it was the last day of the fair, which makes it even more complicated, because you would then have to have India requesting an intervention with the Dutch law enforcement authorities to act on their behalf. So we were kind of in a bit of a conundrum. So we contacted lots of different people. We contacted Interpol, we contacted ICOM, we contacted UNESCO, we spoke with the Dutch Politie, the National Dutch Police Service, who in turn talked to the Metropolitan Police in London, and eventually also spoke with the dealer. And the dealer agreed to bring this particular piece with him on to London, where it could be discussed further and we would determine what the situation was. He had the piece on consignment from a collector. It was not his personal object at this point. So the next stage was to try and determine if this object was in fact the stolen Buddha, and because there was some talk between both the consignor and the dealer themselves that it was not an exact match. So we had to work together, Vijay and I, to determine that yes, this taking the original photo from the museum's archive collection and then superimposing on top of that, as you see in this video, the photos that were taken professionally related to the sale of the object, and then matching them to show that this was in fact the same Nalanda Buddha. The only difference, as you can see, is that there is a slight change between where some of the leaves around the Buddha's head had been broken, and in one case restored on the opposite side. But to ensure that what we were seeing with our eyes was in fact correct, it then went to a neutral party, which ICOM graciously found for us, that was not related to my organization, ARCA or India Pride Project, to look at the piece and give their recommendation to the Metropolitan Police as to if this object was in fact a match for the piece that had been stolen in India. Now, at this point, a decision needs to be made. No charges are being pressed in this particular case. The possibility of the country of India being able to buy back their artwork, if they buy back every stolen idol, is not only not acceptable, but it's also highly unlikely. So Scotland Yard worked very closely with the dealer in this particular case and the consignor, who agreed to relinquish this particular object voluntarily. And that was a big success for India. There's a restitution ceremony in London, which was lovely, but we still don't know who stole these objects. We still don't know anything more than we knew the day that we spotted the object at the fair, because in order to enact a voluntary restitution, we basically have to name dealers, not name consignors, and to just accept that this object would come home. And while that's a win on one hand, all those other pieces of paper you saw for the other objects that were stolen from the museum might have been found. We might have had more information had we been able to pursue it on an investigative level, which we could not in this particular case. So this is an example of that I like to use when the market talks about, well, there's not that many cases, very few people have been prosecuted for art crime. And that's true. And part of the reason for that is that sometimes restitutions are made in a voluntary way to kind of smooth the waters and just, not say that anyone is involved in this particular case in a very public way that would be damning to their reputation, or that would result in years of litigation before an object would come back. Sometimes my organization also gets, little notices from people that will write to us to say, take a look at this object. Can you give me your thoughts? Or this doesn't look right. Or I recognize this particular dealer's name. And in this case, we had an object where someone sent me a link to an object that was about to go to auction 1 month ahead of the auction for an Etruscan antifix, a polychrome terracotta antifix. So the first thing I did was obviously open the link, take a look at the object, and what information was available on this particular auction house's website to say where this object had come from and whose hands it had passed through over time. So the provenance research on this particular object mentioned Ingrid Mickelpine. Mickelpine is a dealer was a dealer, in London and Epsom, in the early 1990s that we know has handled pieces of art that have passed through illicit hands in the past. So my first thought when seeing this is, okay, there's a little bit of suspicion here that this could be perhaps a looted object. Hold on one second. I need to turn off my phone because it's ringing. Forgive me, guys. But again, there's not enough information here for us to go on. So I look back through different records. I speak with Paolo Giorgio Ferri, who was the Italian prosecutor for cases that had involved pieces that had gone through Bruce and Ingrid McAlpin's hands. And he forwarded me a couple of documents that referred to this particular dealer in the UK and their involvement of, selling and buying pieces from that were sourced through Giacomo Medici, who is a famous trafficker in Italy. So again, I have information here that leads me to believe that these pieces could be suspect, but I have no actual proof that this particular antifix was suspect. What I did have was examples of 3 other antifixes that have been restituted from different museums, 2 from the Nye Carlsberg Glyptothek, 1 from the John Paul Getty Museum. But these particular antifixes were slightly different in shape. So again, still not enough to go on. So then I went back as far as 1918, looking through a book of records with the Villa Giulia, which is the Etruscan museum in Rome, hoping to find information or perhaps a similar antifix to the one that I had, since they would be made with molds, much like the ones that you see here in this particular picture, hoping to find something that could identify which site these particular objects had come by. Unfortunately, at this point, I still didn't have enough information to go on. So we requested a condition report from the auction house to get information about this particular piece. They sent us, a photograph of each side of the object and 2 provenance documents. One was just a list of inventory. So this is not even an invoice of any certain type, which lists the antifix as antifix with musician, not antifix of a musician, because she's holding a crotola in her hand. So this particular inventory, to me, even though it's being used by the auction house to legitimize this particular sale, is suspect to me, because the wording doesn't match what the object is, despite the fact that it does say antifix on it. The price of the object on this list from 1994 was also 35,000 euros, $35,000, which was significantly higher than what the estimated sale price for this particular object was going to be. So again, didn't quite match up with how the artwork would be devalued over time versus, increased in value, or at least maintain its current price. The only other document provided by the auction house was, basically a stock number document, stapled to a photograph of a stock document, which lists a vendor and also refers to the terracotta antifix, but again, using an even second description to the one previously of the object itself. So we have 2 documents, neither that describe the object correctly, and neither which show that the object was sold in any way at any point in time. The problem being, we had no proof of where this object would have come from, other than we know that these types of objects would come from Etruria. So despite, a month's lead time to try and recover this object, it was not sufficient information to stop the sale. Again, we tried, just as we had in the image with the Buddhas, to superimpose the image one on top of the other, but to no avail. We just really didn't have enough to go on. In the end, this particular antifix was purchased through the generosity of Bulgari, the jewelry company, who then donated the object back to the Villa Giulia. And in the process of the lengthy time it took to determine would Villa Giulia accept an object on donation from Bulgari, the curators at the Villa Giulia, working in coordination with material that I didn't have access to on open source, were able to find an almost exact match to the antifix that we had identified in the market. And that's the one that you see photographed on this particular blackboard next to the object after it's been restituted back to Italy. And this particular object was found in 1937, just north of Rome, in a sanctuary that had long been looted by Tombaroli in the past. So not, again, this is another example of an object that comes back to the country of origin without any prosecution of anyone at any point in time. So again, not something that would raise alarms in the market or say that a specific dealer acted in bad faith. But again, we've had two objects that have come home, which is sometimes what you hope for. I use this little picture. This is actually a picture from Sherlock Holmes film to kind of demonstrate what it's like to try and look through and find connections between dealers. And sometimes when you're a researcher looking for stolen art, it's a lot more complicated on our side to try and recreate what has happened in the past. But sometimes if people do their homework on the front end of things, they can save themselves quite a bit of headache. So I'm going to move on to my third case study so that we still have time for everybody to talk here, which is the case of a golden coffin that was purchased by the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which has since been restituted back to the country of Egypt. The provenance on this particular coffin was listed as coming from 1971 with an export license from the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, and that it had belonged to this stock of an ancient art dealer in Cairo, active in the 1930s, whose name was Habib Taradros. So on face value, you've got a museum that is looking for an object for their collection, a high value object. They paid over $3.5 million for this particular piece that looks to have legitimate paperwork. In the 2017-2018 volume of their publication that they send out to their donors, they actually say that, that this particular object was looked at by museum staffers in 2016, and that it took them more than a year of careful study of the 1971 export license from Egypt before they decided to move forward with the purchase of this particular golden coffin. So when at face value now, looking back on the restitution, 1 year of careful study looking at the export license, they failed to notice that the export license for the country involved was not the same country. So they completely missed that the name for the country of Egypt, or what is now considered Egypt, was the United Arab Republic. Okay. If they had done a basic search of just historical documents, they would have seen in a year's time that the names are written particular document don't match up with the names of the particular country as it was at the claimed time of its export, making that export license false. What happened? To save face, to behave ethically, the Metropolitan Museum of Art relinquished this coffin back to Egypt, having lost a huge sum of money that could have been avoided had they earlier on done a bit more research in that year's time before purchasing the object. It didn't take a room full of tracing this dealer to that dealer, to this trafficker to that trafficker. They would have seen right away that this particular object was not valid in the art market had they done just a basic history search of the background into the country of Egypt and what the territory was named at the particular time that it was alleged that this coffin left the country. My last case study is going to look just briefly at the Museum of the Bible, which is a museum that has been founded by private donors who own a large corporation in the US called Hobby Lobby. When this museum first started to gain public attention for having suspect art in its collection, well, several years, I might add, after Dr. Mazza began saying, hey, look, we need to look more closely at this particular collection, a lot of the news kind of picked up on it and said that Hobby Lobby was funding terrorism by buying ancient art from, people from the Middle East that, would then go to groups like ISIS. And that's not quite the way this particular story went. The buyers were buying art from lots of different people. But none of them that we have determined, at least, were terrorists from Daesh or from people working within Iraq or Syria. So this is Scott Carroll. He was the principal buyer for the Green collection, their private collection, as well as the pieces that eventually ended up in the Museum of the Bible. And Mr. Green spent a lot of time buying a lot of art very, very rapidly, increasing the size of the collection, which would become the basis and the foundation for the Museum of the Bible, too rapidly to really and truly give much precedence to where the art was coming from. On his Facebook page, he would make comments about pieces that he was purchasing. And one of the things he wrote back in 2013 was, I see things like this every 3 weeks, and in a matter of a day, sort through everything of interest, assess its value, talk to the collector, offer some money, and acquire everything. So how you can buy thousands of objects, in a matter of a day, which he himself says he did, with any level of due diligence is highly suspect. And as a result of this, it has cost the Museum of the Bible considerably, both in terms of, setting the impression of building a historic museum from a private collection, but also in terms of the ethics involved and the oversight involved in the museum itself. So Mr. Carroll bought art from lots of different people. Some of the pieces that arrived into the Museum of the Bible's collection were originally sold on eBay through traffickers that were known to be selling papyrus from Egypt. That type of papyrus from that particular dealer was later traced even into photographs with Scott Carroll's Facebook page, shown on the same pieces of tablecloth. You can see these little flowers that are listed on these particular papers, as well as on a photo bucket page by the trafficker himself, showing that there was at least, and I'll go back to this slide again with Mr. Carroll, at least direct communication at some point in time where these particular photos were being traded back and forth before the pieces ended up in the Museum of the Bible. Carroll also bought from academics, or the Museum of the Bible bought from academics. This is a photo of Dirk Obenk, who is presently under investigation in the United Kingdom for his role in selling material that he had access to the Museum of the Bible. And where are these people now? What's happened with the Museum of the Bible and these suspect pieces of the collection? Well, we know that some pieces from the Egypt Exploration Society have been returned, pieces that came through Dirk Obenk's hands and the hands of other dealers that sold those pieces, kind of in a more circuitous route, have been returned back to the EES. Scott Carroll has never been charged, and he's currently working independently of the museum now. He no longer works for the museum, but has his own company that he's referred to at different times as the Ancient Asset Investment Model, or God's Ancient Library. And he takes artworks from different purchases that he's made or that collectors have made and use them for academic purposes to, as well as incentivizing people through tax write-offs to continue to buy ancient art in kind of a buy by saving or a save by buying model, but has not actually been charged. Der Gobink, on the other hand, has been charged, at least formally. Now, what will happen with that particular case is too early to tell. But in March 2020, the Museum of the Bible's chairman of the board agreed to give back basically the bulk of the papyri fragments within the Museum of the Bible's collection, as well as 6,500 artifacts from Iraq, all because of the fact that the provenance material did not substantiate that these purchases were made with sufficient due diligence. So that's a huge amount of money that was spent by the Greens for objects for their museum, which were then, written into US tax law. They can be considered tax donations, but in fact were, most likely in all cases of suspect origin, at least, if not illicit origin outright. So this is a problem where you see objects repeatedly going home, lots of objects, not one or two, or not small objects, but substantial objects and substantial quantities of objects that are not the result of law enforcement cases that end in prosecution. So the market sometimes does look like it's less dirty than it might be, or sometimes looks more dirty than it might be. It's very difficult to understand what's been found versus what still needs to be found. And with that, I'll open the floor to discussion, I hope, with Roberta and Marcel, and see if they've got something that they want to add to this discussion from here, and anybody that might have questions and answers. So
yeah,
welcome Roberta and welcome Marcel.
Thank you very, very much. So yeah, brilliant. So we're all coming. Roberta's still on mute. And Marcel, if you want to turn your video on, that would be great. We could see your face. There you are, brilliant. And you're on mute. Thank goodness you could join us. You missed the introduction to yourself, but I hope that's all right. So, but thank you.
I know I am.
Exactly, you don't need that. Yeah, it's not that late in the year yet. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk, Lynda. It was wonderful. We've got two questions that came through during your talk. So shall I ask you those, and then we can pass over to Roberta and Marcel for their discussion? Does that make sense to you? So the questions are, one came through very early on in your talk, and it said, I understand it's not easy to estimate, but can we break down into percentage per type of art? So painting, archaeology and furniture. So I guess that's talking about the types of objects that are looted.
Okay. All right. I'll start with that one, and then we'll go on to the next one. Patrice, thanks for the question. It's a very good question. And it would be great if we could. One of the obstacles to finding percentages or to looking at specific typology of art as it's related to what's looted and whatnot is how different countries quantify their material. So I'm going to use the Netherlands as an example. And many countries work under a similar format to the Netherlands. So police organizations, when you're looking at recoveries of objects or stolen objects, will classify theft by value. So in the Netherlands, a $1,500 bicycle has the same police report as a $1,500 painting if it were stolen. So tweezing that data out from police records to say these thefts were artwork and these thefts were automobiles and these thefts were bicycles is impossible. Okay.
Right.
And there is not a mandate for reporting that information either, in the sense of, in human trafficking, there are mandates. Drug trafficking, there are mandates where there are reports that are produced by certain countries annually that help, create global statistics on things. But having said that, what we see are trends. So I can't say, yes, there's 20% paintings and 16% Greek sculpture and 2% Libyan sculpture or 5% papyrus. But what we see is that when the market gets too hot in one particular area, the type of sculpture that is looted and readily available in the market changes over time.
Right.
So We've seen waves of Greek pottery. We've seen waves of Etruscan pottery. We've seen some waves of high-end Cambodian art. We've seen, you know, manuscripts that came out of the Balkan Wars come to market several years after the Balkan Wars. We've seen a trend of Indian and Southeast Asian art in general, Tibetan art, come through in trends where people are, you know, when the material arrives in the hands of dealers that are willing to deal with art that doesn't have a decent pedigree, is oftentimes when it's like put out there on the market as the, you know, the new black, you know, it's the new color, you know, why don't you add this to your collection? It's really nice or really interesting. So I hope that answers a little bit about why it's difficult.
It does. I think you've disappeared from our screens, Lynda, but which is probably I'm not quite sure why. Maybe it's your video, but it's probably a good time to bring in Roberta and Marcel if you wanted to start teasing out some of the issues that Lynda discussed in her talk. Then that would be brilliant. Yeah, there you are. You're back, Lynda.
Sorry, I don't know what I touched.
No, don't worry.
Should I get a start, perhaps?
Yes, yeah, please do, Roberta.
Woman.
You're on the top of my screen as well, so.
Okay, so, well, that was a very rich paper, Lynda, so thank you. I have some notes, but they are so rich that actually I would like to start with this last point that was raised by the question, that is the creation of a market, which is what has happened with the Museum of the Bible, which created a big boom and a big vibe surrounding a certain kind of objects that is biblical manuscripts and also papyri that was quite unusual. I remember one of the comments of Sam Fogg, one of the main dealers in manuscripts and ancient books, saying, "Oh, this is so exciting because now people are interested in, you know, Bibles that were not so looked for." So the market is somehow inducing changes in prices. The other big actor in the making of prices are academics, which is what brought me, you know, in the world of the art market and all these issues that indeed was not my, you know, first field. Since I started seeing how academics, even specialists like papyrologists, that is such a hard word to spell, were interacting, you know, with a specific collector, Mr. Green, who had in his mind this big achievement, also, you know, in theory a good one, but it was really performed in the worst way he could have done, and academics who were keen on, you know, jumping on board for different reasons. There were those who actually hoped and made a lot of money because some of the sums that were, you know, going around were incredible. And also those who were just happy to publish an interesting manuscript because it's not that easy to have some. So the role of academics is a really serious one, and create also a market, because some of the prices that were, you know, given to papyri, even, you know, the Sappho, the famous Sappho one, was absolutely out of any kind of mind, which is also linked to the other problem of collectors and eventually donors that then have these tax kind of rebates, so tax invoices that is the other side of the medal. So to come back, for instance, to that Bulgari example, I honestly am not that happy for what has happened. That is, on the one hand, yes, of course, I'm happy as an Italian to see something coming back home, but I don't think that it is the way, you know, to do it. Even if Mr. Bulgari, I'm not an expert of Italian legislation, had something back, and actually he did, because there is even, you know, the being on the newspaper, which is a good thing. That is not the way forward. The way forward is, you know, to prosecute people and to achieve something. So this is just one of my first. And the other thing that I want to add, and then I will leave the floor to the others, is, you know, the problem of provenance and the competence of people who are in charge of purchases for museums and libraries. So to be, you know, educated to research the history of pieces before even, you know, thinking to buy, it's very important. But before buying and before publishing, I would add, in the case of academics. So there is a lot of education also to be done in this respect. I don't want to take all the time, so Marcel.
Yeah, okay, so to chip in further on the subject of academics then, and thank you for hosting me. I'm sorry for the hiccups at the beginning. I had to restart my computer to get into Zoom for some reason.
No, thank you.
Yeah, anyway, yeah, academics have a lot that they can contribute positively towards the problem of the trade in illicitly sourced artifacts. They don't just have a potential negative impact by, you know, publishing objects that they find interesting and thereby lending not just those artifacts, but all sorts of similar artifacts a sort of enhanced commercial value, even if they are perhaps of problematic provenance. Academics tend to actually sort of ignore the art market and focus on material that is already in public collections and museums and universities and so on. And that single-minded focus is also a problem. I think we should look, scholars should look at material wherever it may be. It is part of the total body of evidence to consider when we are studying the history of humankind and the history of cultures. But of course, we do need to think carefully about what publications of artifacts may contribute to, and it is not necessarily the first thing to be on our minds. We can study objects without necessarily publishing them. I would like to add here that when the subject of the art market is brought up among scholars, many of them will just raise their hands and say, oh, the art market, I won't have anything to do with that. And I don't actually think that this is in any way helpful. It is a different way of, in fact, contributing to the problem. There has to be a middle way here. And that middle way, I think, should come in the form of the provision of expertise that can inform the provenance research to be done by other parties, whoever they may be. They can be collectors, whether they be public or private, doesn't terribly matter. Even a museum can make mistakes, as Lynda has illustrated, in deciding to purchase certain artifacts. And they may, in fact, not have had any access to data that might have changed their view on an artifact. No one can know everything, and no one can have access to all the relevant sources to inform an opinion. This is why there need to be people, there need to be scholars who collect information in a systematic way and who can make judgments not over isolated artifacts, you know, just viewed on their own, but by looking at larger swathes of artifacts, which of course can only be done on the basis of a database. data need to be collected, and then patterns may emerge, such as a preponderance of objects coming from the same archaeological sites. A preponderance that, moreover, may pass overwhelmingly through a relatively limited number of dealers, which of course raises another concern as to their suppliers. If a picture emerges of material from one side being supplied effectively in bulk to one or a small number of dealers, this obviously indicates that we are not dealing with bona fide suppliers, like old collections of some, unnamed but supposedly well-established collector, because no collector will by the merest chance just acquire artifacts that come overwhelmingly or even exclusively from one or two archaeological sites. So these are things worth researching. And of course, very few people would have the time to gather that sort of evidence and to come to a well-informed appraisal. So there is a need for people who care about this problem to get access to that sort of expertise, and not to be necessarily required to hold all that expertise in-house. It's just not possible. It is a very specialist kind of research that needs to be done, and it requires considerable resources. And this is why I started the Circulating Artifacts project a few years ago, because I think that sort of expertise needs to be made available to people who genuinely care about the problem. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you very much, Marcel. Thank you, Roberta. I don't know whether you want to come back on, and Lynda as well, come back on anything that you each said, or did anything resonate, or we could start going to questions, because actually the questions are beginning to pick up on threads that you're discussing. So one of them is from Peter Campbell, my former colleague, and I know he's known to you, Lynda, and actually suggested you for this presentation. So thank you, Peter, for tuning in. He says, and it does pick up on what Marcel was saying, it would be interesting to hear from all three of you what needs to be implemented in order to combat illicit trafficking. Is it laws, or is it enforcement, or is it prosecutions, or is it about cultural options? I don't know whether you've got thoughts on that.
I do.
Yeah, yeah.
I think we all three have. I think that, what we need first and foremost, if I look at the examples of the Museum of the Bible and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which are very, very recent problems with collections, they are both problems with collections that could have been avoided very, very early on had they had a dedicated provenance researcher in their organization that is specifically looking at the artwork for its legitimacy in the market. Oftentimes when it's just the person that is trying to augment a collection or enhance the story of an existing collection with, specific pieces, their goal is completely different. And sometimes even more, and most importantly, their training is different. Their training is to look at, is the artifact authentic? What period does it come from? What kind of story will it tell that'll bring in visitors to the museum? In both of those two cases, had they had a dedicated provenance researcher that would have looked at those documents of provenance, one, it wouldn't have taken us a year for us to determine that that license was false, okay? And two, it would have helped law enforcement earlier on in the process to know which dealers that were handling this particular object needed to be looked at. So first and foremost, I would say provenance researchers in every single museum that is dealing with ancient art. And that is not the case in most countries, okay? In fact, I can't tell you where it is the case in a single country. Second to me would be dedicated public.
Sorry, Lynda, may I just jump in here? Because
Sure.
before you move to a slightly different subject, what you're saying there about the need for provenance researchers in museums, of course, I would wholeheartedly agree with that. But also to note here that the overwhelming focus typically among scholars on authenticity rather than questions of provenance also applies, in fact, to art fairs where vetters are brought in mainly to look at the question of authenticity and quality and whether the labeling is correct in terms of whether an object is from whatever, the 18th dynasty rather than the 19th dynasty. But the single most important question is, of course, the one of provenance. And to be fair to the vetters, it is extremely difficult to have a walkthrough of a fair and sort of decide on the spot whether an object has provenance issues. These things cannot, in fact, be decided on the spot. Vetters should, in fact, be enabled to spend more time prior to the fair to genuinely look into pieces for potential provenance problems so that people can be warned on time in a well-informed way. I don't know.
Can I jump in, because this is very interesting. I started an interaction with a number of collectors of manuscripts while, you know, digging into the Museum of the Bible issue. And what I noticed was that they too came, you know, to this world of collecting in a sort of naive way in terms of provenance. Many of them, for instance, when I raised the question, you know, the famous Sappho papyrus at the center of the major scandal actually was on sale through a private treaty by Christie's. I mean, it's Christie's. So, you know, and everyone who was interacting with me, really serious collectors, were saying, well, but you know, if it was sold from Christie's, in our mind, is a good sort of seal of you know, good provenance too. So I think that when cases like this one then go to the public, it is very good, because many of these people who previously had some sort of ideas about, you know, yes, provenance and how to buy, from where to buy. They wouldn't have ever bought, for instance, from the famous guy on eBay. They didn't, but they were buying through Christie's. So education is a very good tool. Sometimes I believe that even more than I saw that Professor Fentres is mentioning the rules of the academic societies, which are good indeed as well. And as a papyrologist, now we are revising everything, of course, and perhaps we will follow the rules at this point, but it's really education. So for instance, in our classrooms, as you know, university professors or lecturers teach about provenance also to people like epigraphists and papyrologists who are only looking at these objects, not as objects actually, but as texts. And so they are fixated with this forgery thing, but not with provenance. So that's very important, in my opinion.
Thank you, Roberta. That answered 2 points that have come up. One, as you say, from Elizabeth Frenchess, who says the Archaeological Association of America requires that its members pledge not to publish unprovenance objects. And this isn't the case in Italy or France, but she doesn't know about the UK. So that was a comment from her. And it sort of begins to answer a comment from Aubrey Catrone, who says, do you think that there are specific qualifications or training provenance researchers should have to help the handling of illicit materials? So I mean, you talking about that at undergraduate level in your courses is an important dimension to that, I imagine.
Lynda? Huh?
Yes. Okay. Roberta was talking about it, so I wasn't sure that was directed towards
well,
you.
yes.
We do have a training program for postgraduates, so at least a BA level, to provide additional information to teach people about the things that they need to be aware of. It is a program, though, that is, it evolves over time. So not any one program is the perfect fit for everybody. I would like to think that ARCA is the perfect program to teach everybody everything they need to know, but that would be incorrect if I said that, because there's a lot to be learned from lots of different programs that exist. It just depends on how deeply the individual wants to go down into this subject matter. I would recommend that provenance researchers not just like hang out a shingle and start like advising people, which is often the case. People are advising more from the value, or to, inform collectors in terms of how to, maintain the value of their collection without really having a good understanding or grasp of how pieces are laundered into the art market. So yes, they do require some training. I like to think we do it well, but as Roberta said, we are starting to see a shift in academic programs at the undergraduate level and at the master's level, where this subject is now being brought up in art historical settings or in settings with textual cultures or things like this, where there'll be at least one class from one professor or another that will acknowledge that this is an issue. But I don't think one class is probably going to be enough to fix what's wrong with the market.
I think that every one of us has to do their own job about their material. Then there is the other problem, that is how to prepare people who are going to work, let's say, for the museum. So that's another thing that is, for instance, I've looked at some, provenance as provided by some of these auction houses online to their clients for research, of course, about, the provenance of a certain item. That's ludicrous. It's ludicrous because it's ludicrous per se, and also because, you can't really have an idea if, a PDF is an original or it's forged and so forth, so on. So here you must have, the tools of criminology as well. And we should ask auction houses and dealers to be much more transparent in their provenance, the providing of provenance, even in their websites, which are very often, starting with Christie's and going to all the rest, ludicrous.
Yeah, no, I can understand that. And thank you for discussing, Lynda, bringing up your courses, because it addresses partially a question from Nils, which says that there's different subject matters might have different approaches to the field of provenance research. So there's a question from John Miller, who says, in your pyramid, there was no mention of the increasing use of illicit artifacts in money laundering. Big money endangers people. Is this an area in which you might comment?
Marcel, do you want to comment, or?
I'll go for it.
Okay. The reason I don't have money laundering on the pyramid is twofold. One, it's a pyramid that I've adapted from another researcher who does excellent work in this particular field. But also importantly, when you look at money laundering, most people don't just like hang out a shingle and say, I'm a money launderer. They generally have a business behind their shingle, which is in effect laundering money. Okay, so if it's through elegant bribery that you sometimes see in China, for example, where you would pay a bribe through a work of art and then you arrange for that work of art to be sold at a higher value so that you like transfer the money of the bribe through the sale of art. The person that is gifting that work of art is a businessman, with, an industrialist or anybody else that would want to perhaps influence peddle. So there is money laundering that goes on, but the person has another particular role within the pyramid. What that particular identifier, though, is looking at people within the art market itself. And there are some money launderers in that market, and some of those are under investigation by the US courts and courts within Europe and in the UK as well. But oftentimes they have different positions as well that already embed themselves into the market. So I didn't necessarily tweeze it out.
Great, thank you very much. Do you, Roberta and Marcel, do pitch, and you can see the questions as well. We've got one from an anonymous attendee, a question in Italian, which asks, that we have this global market, and how these objects, thinking about circulation, but I guess they're asking about the role of free ports. Can you see there kind of how they could be used to think about sort of the illicit trade of antiquities?
Yes, well, free ports obviously enable objects to go into hiding for a long time. There is, it's well known how artifacts may be kept for years or even decades, which of course provides an opportunity to launder the objects themselves, to create fake histories of supposedly time-honored collections in which those artifacts were supposedly kept. Yeah, the problem is well known, but it's also difficult to determine how this can be addressed. I don't know what you want to say, Lynda.
I would only add to the fact that when it was first identified that free ports were a problem, there are now procedures in place that are designed to help minimize that. But the procedures that have been put in place are basically that you categorize what's going into the free port as an ancient object using a series of codifications in the documentation for placing the objects within the free port. And then those documents are reviewed by, the last time I checked, at least as it relates to Port Franc, by KPMG, which is a financial audit firm. So in my mind, you just put the mummy coffin in the back seat of the Ferrari that you're storing at the free port, and you list it as a Ferrari. Having a document that doesn't wave a flag saying, yes, I put ancient art in your free port, to me is not going to solve the problem because of the privacy laws that are allowed as it relate to free ports. There's been some talk about making those rules a bit more strict, but they generally get voted down by the holders of the free ports themselves worldwide.
I guess my question is thinking about the identification of objects, and your first case study, you drew attention to the fact that you put the photograph over the top of the objects and the leaves weren't quite matching. Is there a sort of tendency, and I don't know if it's deliberate or not, to alter objects through conservation and restoration so they look still authentic enough to be the actual object, but changed so they're not the object? I don't know, do objects get modified and altered to enter the market, if you see what I mean?
Well, I mean, we have seen instances of objects that have been stolen from museums that have been damaged on one side when they know that there's a like an archival photo of one side of an object, but not of the reverse side. So, a vase will then be restored with the part that's identifiable removed and then filled in. But, is that conjecture, or is it just things that get broke along the way? Sometimes intentionally, sometimes just because they're mishandled along the way. I don't know that there's enough evidence to say per se if it's altered for that particular reason.
For what concerns manuscripts and books, especially those stolen from libraries, of course, they are often altered, dismembered. The dismembering of book and manuscripts, even some of the papyri from the Egypt Exploration Society were cut. And this is for altering the object, of course, but also for increasing the incoming.
Right, yeah.
Yes, so
you got 5 objects rather than 1.
Especially when you are dealing with these sales online, because now we are talking a little bit about, you know, the sort of upscale kind of market. But let's remember that as it has been noticed, for instance, by Neil Brody in one of his last contributions, that actually the market in these small tokens that can be, you know, a fragment of papyrus or little gems and things is exploding online, because these little things that can be bought for, let's say, $100 are enticing the wish to own a little bit of the past by such a huge amount of, you know, the market possibilities have become huge. So we often focus on the beautiful, like the wonderful golden mummy case, but we have a serious problem with small objects which are coming from those, you know, moon those holes that Lynda was talking about. So this is also a problem of damaging archaeological sites and our possibility really to, you know, have a context of what we are studying. So it's even bigger than we might think.
There's the added issue of larger objects being broken to smaller pieces simply to make it easier to smuggle them abroad from the source country. Objects get divided. Often only the best parts are kept at all. Let's say coffins, these are very large objects that are difficult to handle and to ship abroad in their entirety. So what often happens is that, well, for starters, the case proper is discarded, and the lid, especially, I mean, the mummiform coffins from Egypt are typically reduced to the commercially most attractive part. This is done by the looters and the traffickers themselves, so they go for the faces, the heads, or, you know, at least just the top half of the top third of the body of the complete figure, and the rest is discarded or allowed to be destroyed. So you also lose in the process, of course, the inscriptions that are on the coffins and that would have identified the original owners. So there's a massive industrial destruction of history going on there.
Yeah, it struck me that that's a major problem. And actually Will Corner, who's from the Art Loss Register, he's listening, and he says we do see what seems to be deliberate alterations to pictures, furniture, and occasionally clocks and other antiques, but it's less so the case for antiquities. So thank you very much, Will, for tuning in. It's really pleased. We're going towards 6:30, 7:30 Italian time. You've all been wonderful. I know that you can see the questions, our panelists. So if there's one that I've missed out, you have a burning desire to answer. But if not, I think we should have a part 2 of this, because it's been, I don't know, I've had my eyes opened. I should say that I have worked in a previous life at Christie's and Bonham's. So I'm sort of sitting here thinking, goodness. But it's been absolutely fantastic. And we hope that we could invite you all to the BSR in Rome when travel is allowed, and it would be lovely to have you. Yeah, it's a promise. There's an open invitation, and to see you all together, it would be wonderful. And if we could continue this discussion in person, that would be brilliant, or turn it into some sort of workshop. That would be really good. But I should say thank you so much for giving up your time, for persisting with the technological issues we had at the beginning. They didn't show through, I don't think, on the actual presentations. That's wonderful. And that we just look forward to, I'll send the questions to you and circulate those to you so that you can ponder them. But I hope that we can meet in person at the BSR and we can have that dinner. And yeah, if you're in the lecture theatre, there'll be a round of applause. So I send my virtual round of applause. I think you can hear them through the number of comments which are just saying, thank you for a great seminar. It's a really brilliant workshop. So I hope we can do that again. So thank you to our panelists.
Thank you
too.
Lovely.
Thank you all.
Well, we got through.
Yeah.
And thank you to Alyssa for making sure that everyone could join. So thank you very much. I shall download the questions and comments tomorrow. But take good care and have a good Christmas break.
All right.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
very much. Bye-bye.